Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another bit of Total War Warhammer 2 quick match gameplay. This time around I'm playing as the dwarves against the High Elves led by Aristides on the map Ancient Dragon Cave. And obviously our good old short friends have gotten some reasonable buffs and changes in this last patch. And of course here we are fighting against our ancient nemesis, the High Elves. So this should definitely promise to be a fun match. So let's see how things break down. Right off the bat, of course, you can see that I did feel the Rune Lord as my lord, and that is for a few different reasons. I did actually put him on an Anvil of Doom. Now, this does make him a little more susceptible to enemy assassination, but it does give him a little more magic resistance, which was the key factor. It also gives him a little more HP. And the main reason, though, that I brought the Rune Lord is because, obviously, despite elves obviously will not do that well against dwarves and ranged combat, just because the High Elves have very poor armor piercing values on their bows, and the dwarves do tend to have shields and a lot of armor. But nonetheless, I did decide to bring a Master Rune of Grungni just to give me that 20% missile resistance, because that'll make them even less effective, at least within a certain AoE. Especially, this is very important for my unshielded units, because I did bring quite a few, and that's because High Elves can of course bring some very nasty, heavily armored units that could cause me a big pain. Alongside that, I did bring Rune of Hearth and Home, because of course elves can bring a lot of terror-causing units. Their Phoenix Guard causes fear, they can bring dragons, they can bring phoenixes, all of which are kind of likely, or I assume to be kind of likely against dwarves, because dwarves of course have huge issues. They're famous for their problems with monsters and large units, because they simply don't have the mass to stop them. Then I did bring a Master Rune of Oath and Steel. Surprisingly, I know a lot of people don't like bringing the Armor Rune, but I figured against High Elves once again, just because they have a lot of non-armor piercing damage and a lot of non-armor piercing unit types, especially between their cavalry and their ranged fire. This could be a pretty useful rune. I also brought Master Rune of Wrath and Ruin, simply for damage. It does have a debuff, but I figured it would be good to get knocking out a small unit of Phoenix Guard or a Swordmaster of Hoth, which of course I was anticipating for the front line, because those guys will do very well against dwarves. And then a Master Rune of Negation, which of course is just 44% damage resistance. There's not much to say there. It's just very powerful. Very, very good defensive ability. And of course, the Rune Lord is pretty tanky himself. Between 120 armor, 52 melee defense, 25% physical resistance, 35 missile resistance, and 40% magic resistance, he is a very, very tough nut to crack for really anything your opponent throws at you, all things considered. Despite the fact that, of course, being on a large mount, he will not be knocked down. Now, alongside him, I brought two Thanes, and the Thanes are there to give me a little more combat ability, because they themselves are very, very potent combat lords, or combat heroes. Though, to be fair, their melee attack is not that impressive. I do believe a baseline of 45. It is being buffed here by their Master Rune of Stromny Redbeard. And that is one of the cool things that have been reworked. Obviously, most potions, generic sort of scrolls and all those sorts of things have been removed and replaced with usually unique items or runes or whatever on your lords, or on your heroes and lords. And so the Thanes have access to two unique items. One is the Master Rune of Stromny Redbeard, which provides an AoE leadership and melee attack buff, which I thought would be amazing. And alongside that, they do the Tormentor Sword, which I'm really excited to use here. It's 19 seconds of reduced melee attack and immobility to units. So I figured that this could be a really useful kind of crowd control spell and help me against enemy cavalry, or help me debuff enemy infantry that I need to break quickly with my front line. Of course, these guys are being buffed a bit by the Rune Lord, and of course, they do provide their own encouragement aura. They do have their built-in magic and missile resist. They're very, very tanky against ranged fire once again. These guys will be very, very tough to kill. And they'll hopefully provide me with some extra damage. Now, for my front line, for my actual infantry units, I do have in the center here, I have Dwarf Warriors with great weapons, Veteran up to rank 3, and Miners with blasting charges, hoping to get a little action out of those, and then still have some armor piercing on them. Obviously, their armor is at 80, which will still make them relatively tanky against Elven Fire. And of course, they're dirt cheap, so it's basically okay. Then, units of Longbeards are here. Longbeards got a buffed to their armor recently, and so these guys are very tanky. Of course, they also have psychological immunity. That's kind of why I'm putting them out here on the flanks, where they don't get the buff from the Rune Lord, because it's basically irrelevant. They don't really need it. These guys have very solid stats overall, and they should just hold their line for a very long time, even if they can't win, because their damage is a little pitiful. Behind that, we have unit I'm sure some of you guys are surprised to see, and that's PK Guard and Hammerers. And in Warhammer 1, I definitely was a little harsh on these guys. I saw them as a pretty niche, fairly worthless unit in most situations. And Definitely was not impressed, and it was kind of the consensus at the time. But I figured that against high elves, because high elves have very poor ranged fire, they can't really bring these guys down. And they have some nasty armored units that, unless I bring Thunderers, I'll definitely struggle to shoot them down. I figured that against Phoenix Guard and Swordmasters of Hoth, Hammers could definitely be good. And Hammers got a recent buff. Their weapon strength went up. It's now 55, split 14-41. They got better melee defense, they got better melee attack, and a better charge bonus. These guys are an absolute monstrous infantry units, and they actually dropped in price. So now they're 1100. PK Guard went from 1600 to 1500. And of course, PK Guard has magic and armor sundering, so these guys, especially against Phoenix Guard, will absolutely brutalize them. Definitely very powerful units there. Finally, I do have 2 units of Slayers. Slayers also dropped in price. I have normal Slayers and Slayers, Dragonback Slayers. Both of these guys went down by 100 in price, which was very nice. That definitely makes it a little easier to cram extra units in my army. And they have decent melee stats. They'll tear through the lightly armored Elven infantry if needed. And of course, they're mostly there to shut down enemy flying lords or enemy flying monsters and enemy cavalry, that sort of stuff that tries to get into my backline. Finally, here we do have a small shooting contingent of Quarrelers. These guys, between their shields and 80 armor, should be able to trade with basically anything the elves bring to the field, and their melee stats aren't pushover level, so they should do okay if needed. Now, throwing things into slow-mo, my opponent brought actually a pretty simplistic but definitely potentially powerful army. Teclis here in the center, coming in with a handful of different abilities. He did come in with the Bound Fiery Convocation, which of course gives him a wind spell that could do quite a bit of damage. Flock of Doom, a little interesting against dwarves, but definitely could do some damage. Enfeebling Foe, which of course is a decent debuff, and most importantly, Net of a Mintok, which could allow him to root some of my units and make him easy to shoot. Shield of Safari, as well as Wild Heart, will definitely help him with, will definitely provide some very nifty buffs as well. Teclis himself is basically a pushover in combat, though, and he doesn't really have any, my opponent has not put him on a mount or given him the Sword of Teclis, so he's actually going to be very weak in combat. For his front line, though, my opponent has gone very heavy duty, very powerful. Now, Phoenix Guard are obviously an anti-large unit. They're basically a halberd unit. But, they're like chosen halberds or something like that, really, or Temple Guard. But they do have armor piercing, and because they have martial mastery rather than martial prowess, they have absolutely ludicrous amounts of melee attack as well as melee defense. So these guys can definitely hit consistently against even fairly high-end dwarf units and dish out a lot of hurt in the process. Plus, they have 100 armor and 30% physical resistance, which is actually rather significant against dwarves because dwarves don't have a lot of magic damage. They have a small handful of units that they can field that cause magic damage. Plus, these guys have charge defense against all, which is a big problem for me. And, of course, they do cause fear, which is not too much of an issue because of how much psychological immunity I have. But against certain dwarf units, it can occasionally be useful, especially if your dwarf opponent goes cheap. Out on the flanks, my opponent does have 2. You can already see the arrow fire coming out of the Thane. It's going to be practically irrelevant. I'm really not worried about this. Between the small size and all that on the Thane, he's a very difficult target to hit with arrows. But in the meantime, these Illyrian Reavers are out here on the flanks, and they could definitely be a bit of a nuisance. They have decent melee stats. They're one of the better light cavalries as far as stats go. But unfortunately, they lack shields, which will definitely make them susceptible to shooting. Then finally, my opponent does have 4 units, of Lothran Seaguard veteraned up a bit. Now, I think that's a bit of an interesting choice because Lothran Seaguard is not particularly great against dwarves. In my opinion, you're better off either bringing... Because dwarves don't struggle to flank, so the benefit in melee stats is not too significant. Dwarves will struggle to flank you, and your combat stats are not really good enough to fight dwarf melee infantry. So really, you're just, in most ways, just a weaker ranged unit that's going to get shot up by dwarf archers. I think that with shields, Lothran Seaguard might be more useful, but definitely without the shields, I think it's a bit of an interesting choice. My opponent might have been hoping to use him to stiffen up his front line as well, and use him as sort of a hybrid unit depending on what I brought. But yeah, we'll see how things go. You can see they're already being focused down. Obviously, these guys are focusing down my miners, but I do pop a Master Rune of Oath and Steel, which is going to give these guys some very solid missile resistance between the 20% they have from being in proximity of the Rune Lord and all that stuff. So I'm just waiting for the Net of Mintok to wear off, and then I'm going to reinitiate my charge. I actually don't even bother pushing in because I don't want to commit any of my units too early and then have them surrounded and shot up. Over here in the back, though, my opponent does sneak his Illyrian Reavers in and gets them on top of my Quarrelers, which is definitely a bit of a problem, and I respond very late. You can see in the meantime, I respond a little late to the, definitely to the Net of Mintok being broken. I turned back my PK Guard to engage on these Illyrian Reavers. You can see a handful of Quarrelers have gone down, but it's nothing too significant. The Illyrian Reavers don't have armor piercing, and their weapon strength is fairly low. You can see they're actually dying and suffering quite badly against the pincer from the Dragonback Slayers. My opponent is trying to shoot at the Quarrelers, which is not going to go well because Quarrelers have armor and they have bronze shields, and they really don't give a darn about Lothern Seaguard. In the meantime, I have thrown my Thane into the fray. I am trying to drop some satchel charges on the Phoenix Guard. Unfortunately, the miners have taken a lot of hurt already, so they don't have a full ammo, I suppose, and they're being focused down even more heavily now by my opponent's crossfire. I have in the meantime casted a Master Rune of Wrath and Ruin on these guys, just trying to whittle them down as much as I can. Casted a Rune of Negation and charged in. Dwarf Warriors with great weapons will not do well against Phoenix Guard. They'll definitely lose pretty decisively, but with the Thane there as well as the Rune Lord, they might have a decent chance. Of course, the Rune Lord is actually counted as large because he is mounted on the Anvil of Doom. In the meantime, those Slayers are tearing through Illyrian Reavers over there, so are the Dragonback Slayers, and my Quarrelers have not suffered enough losses to really inhibit them. So they're just going to keep firing and whittling down these Lothern Seaguard. Out on the flanks, you can see these hammers have committed. They are backing up these Longbeards, and my opponent actually does go for a flank here. But you can see the hammers are definitely already beating away a little bit, racking up a little bit of damage. And as time progresses, these guys will definitely wear away at the Phoenix Guard. Over here you can see the PK Guard has made a charge. They are up to 10 kills, though some of that is definitely cavalry. But now they'll be able to tear through these Phoenix Guard in support of their Thane friend here, and especially with the buffs coming in from the Thane, these guys have ludicrous stats. And you can see the crossfire coming in from the Quarrelers also doing some nasty work. These miners are basically as good as dead, but that's whatever. They're miners, and I don't really mind the fact that my opponent focused them. One of the units of Illyrian Reavers has been shattered, but the other one will shortly come back from over there. Then you can see these Dragonback Slayers are making a charge over here. A bunch of dwarves surrounding the Phoenix Guard and just wailing on him and really beating up on him. Now, the Longbeards aren't doing too well, but the Longbeards do have immunity to psychology, and of course they're dwarves, so they're just not going to break very easily at all. In the meantime, here the Thane and the Dwarf Warriors are doing their very best. They're actually doing an okay job against the Phoenix Guard. And in the meantime, here in the center, the PK Guard has managed to force a breach, destroying this Phoenix Guard. You can see they're up over almost 60 kills, and most of this is Phoenix Guard. So absolutely brutal. And now I'm going to be able, with the center punch through, all these Lothern Seaguard broke, I'm going to be able to collapse on my opponent's flanks. Here you can see the Longbeards are definitely struggling, and the Hammers are not having the best time of it. But slowly but surely, they will eat away at that Phoenix Guard until they win. Interestingly enough, the Slayers actually do pretty well here against the Phoenix Guard, and I was definitely a little surprised by this. They did grand catch him with a charge, but I was definitely surprised by just how well the Slayers did against the Phoenix Guard. It might be because the Phoenix Guard has fairly low attack speed, I do believe, because they're a halberd unit. And the Slayers do a lot of damage, even though they're not anti-large. Over here you can see Illyrian Reavers do charge in, but they're having a very rough time against the Quarrelers, especially because their martial prowess is down, and these guys have no shields, so they're just going to go down like 9 pins. My Quarrelers are going to reorganize, and they're going to be able to keep firing. Even then, my Thane is, of course, coming in, dropping Tormentor Sword, debuffing this Lothern Seaguard and the poor Phoenix Guard, who are just collapsing. My opponent does still have some shooting units, he's just trying to pull back, but it's definitely a bit rough. At this point, there's very few pockets of resistance remaining. You can see I fall back with the hammers. Actually, let's just leave these Longbeards to hold the line for a bit. And I have actually gotten a Rune of Wrath and Ruin on these guys, and you can see it's actually done quite a bit of damage to them. My opponent does cast another Wind spell, which does a decent amount of work here, or at least it does a decent amount of work against these hammers. But it's no end of the world here. You can see the Quarrelers are still fairly healthy, and they're going to be able to just wail on these Phoenix Guards, start whittling them down. They don't have the best armor piercing, but they do have some, and they'll definitely be able to lay the smack down on them. In the meantime, I'm getting a rear charge here with the Rune Lord, who is being hit by an enfeebling foe, but that doesn't matter too much. The Thane's in there right alongside him. These Dragonback Slayers are still holding their ground. And I was definitely impressed in this game, judged by just how well Slayers do against a lot of elf infantry. They do surprisingly well. Now you can see this Phoenix Guard over here is still fairly healthy, but at this point my opponent is definitely doing very poorly as far as most of his units go. And I still have a little bit of ammo, and at that point it is end game. So definitely a pretty fun game. A bit brutal and back and forth. I think the Phoenix Guard would have been an interesting choice. They're not necessarily a bad choice. I think they're sort of like Empire can field halberds against dwarves with some degree of success, provided you build around it. And I think similarly, if you build around Phoenix Guard, they're not necessarily a bad choice against dwarves, especially because they just have physical resistance, armor. They just have so much going for them. Now, in this game, the Quarrelers did absolute MVP work. They shut down my opponent's rear contingent, which he couldn't really do anything about. The poor Illyrian Reavers got slaughtered by the Slayers in the pits. PK Guard proved very useful. I think PK Guard, well, maybe not a must-have, is definitely a very useful pick against elves, because they do give you that armor debuff, and they cause magic damage, which bypasses Phoenix Guard, and you're likely to see some Phoenix Guard in almost every matchup, I think. They're just a very potent unit. Thunders, I think, are the other option if you want to go a little cheaper on your infantry line, because they'll give you armor piercing. You just got to keep in mind that they're not going to be as good at tearing through enemy skirmishers. because they lack range and they have less missile damage. Hammers did okay. The Longbeards is atrocious. The Dwarf Warriors with Great Weapons did surprisingly well, and I think that if you decided to go for a very spammy or wide Dwarven build, it might be not a bad idea to run a bunch of Dwarf Warriors with Great Weapons backed by maybe some Hammers or backed by the Regiment of Round Longbeards. I actually didn't bring them. The Grumbling Guard, which are a very good unit, but I didn't bring them here. The Thanes didn't do much damage, but I think that the Tremendous Sword effect can't be understated, and the fact that they tied my opponent down was very useful, as were those AoE buffs. Same with the Rune Lord. Blinders with Lasting Charge got a surprising amount of kills, all things considered. I think definitely against High Elves, you honestly don't really need shields. High Elves can, of course, bring a lot of shooting if they really want to. But you can win the shooting fight in almost all situations. It's not like the case with Empire, where Empire decides to spam handguns, they'll just tear through you because and there's very little you can do with the Assassin Dwarves. But in the case, though, now with with unit limitations, that's not really a threat anymore either. But unless they did a mix of Outriders and Handgunners. But with Dwarves, you don't really have to worry too much about the High Elves shooting it out with you and winning. So what you can do is go fairly drop shields and bring a very melee armor piercing great weapon oriented build. I think is definitely viable. You just need something to shut down enemy large units, either root them in place, for which the Thane and his Tormentor Sword is not bad. Otherwise, you can do Grimbrindle with smoke bombs. Dragonback Slayers, of course, do have a slight speed debuff as well. As long as you have something to deal with large, though, great weapons, whether Thunders, Slayers, something like that, Thanes, I think with the Tormentor Sword are amazing for that, then you're basically set against the High Elves, and I think that definitely you can get away with doing a very great weapon-centric build. For sure. I think the Hammers have been buffed to the point that they are much more useful. I don't know if they're still the top choice, but if they're a top choice, but I can definitely say they're a much more competitive choice, especially the P-Gate Guard. And yeah. For my opponent here, you can see some of the Phoenix Guard did absolutely champion work. The Phoenix Guard are definitely no pushovers. The Lothern Sea Guard, I think, was a bit of an iffy pick, and they definitely kind of suffered for it. Some of them shot down my miners, but that's a practically irrelevant unit at 400 points. The Lyrian Reavers I don't think are a bad pick. I think my opponent simply got a little unlucky with how they got caught up by the Dragonback Slayers, and PK Guard, and the Quarrelers aren't total pushovers in melee, so they could slug it out with them. Interestingly enough, I actually do think Quarrelers could probably go toe-to-toe with the Lothern Sea Guard in a straight-up fight in melee as well. Because they do have a little more HP, they have much more armor in exchange for somewhat worse stats. So I haven't tested it out, but I think it's quite possible that Quarrelers could win. And yeah. I do hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below. If you have any comments, criticism, any questions about Total War Warhammer, Warhammer 2, anything like that, be sure to post those down in the comments, and I'll respond as soon as I can. As usual, guys, I do appreciate you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.